sponsored by the Institute of Politics, the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and the Health, Education, Labor, and Poverty Student Group of the Kennedy School. I'd like to begin by reading from a letter that was written in late 1988 to the Honorable George Bush, the President-elect of the United States, by Frank Press, who's the President of the National Academy of Sciences, and Sam Thier, now the President of Brandeis, who at that time was the President of the Institute of Medicine. Dear Mr. President-elect, during your term in office, AIDS will claim over 200,000 American lives. It is estimated that 1 million to 1.5 million Americans, mostly young adults, are infected. In the absence of effective therapy, most will die. Your administration can take several actions to slow the spread of this unprecedented epidemic and limit its damaging effects on this and other countries. The Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences have prepared the enclosed white paper to help you meet this challenge. And then the 9th point out of 9 in the enclosed white paper is to recognize our special responsibility in international health efforts to control AIDS is more broadly based than the protection of American troops and tourists. AIDS can destabilize the workforces and the economies of developing countries whose advancement has been aided by U.S. dollars. AIDS can also reverse the child survival figures in countries where our help has only recently improved infant and child survival. Finally, some countries of the world offer important opportunities for collaborative AIDS research because they present varieties and prevalences of diseases that do not exist in the United States. And then there's a bullet. The United States has an additional responsibility to international health efforts to control AIDS because of our exceptional resources in public health specialists and biomedical scientists, the large number of infected persons in the United States, and our relative affluence. So in trying to educate ourselves tonight about this issue, I'd like you in the panel to think about 3 questions. First, what has happened since 1988? Second, what has this country contributed? And third, how have its efforts fallen short? And to address those issues, we have 4 panelists. The first is Jonathan Mann, who may be the most recognized name in the world in association with this subject. He's a professor of epidemiology and international health at the Harvard School of Public Health and director of the International AIDS Center of the Harvard AIDS Institute. But prior to coming to Harvard in 1990, he was from 1986 to 1990 the director of the World Health Organization's global program on AIDS. And in addition to that, he's chairing the 8th Annual International Conference on AIDS, which was to have been in Boston, but has now been moved to Amsterdam. So Jonathan will set the stage for the evening, and he'll return at the end to try to sum things up.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is to give you a sense of the current shape of this epidemic, a sense of where it's going, and something about how we're doing broadly, globally, in dealing with this pandemic. In 1981, at the time AIDS was first discovered, there were probably about 100,000 people around the world who were HIV infected. That number increased over 100-fold during the 1980s, so that today we estimate there are between 10 and 12 million HIV-infected people around the world. These people are not uniformly distributed around the world. About 7 million, or more than 7 million of them, are in Africa, about 1 million in North America, about 1 million infected people in Latin America, about 1 million infected people in Asia, and about 500,000 infected people in Europe. Of the roughly 10 to 12 million infected people today, about 7 million are men and over 4 million are women. The sex ratio of women to men, or women to men infected and affected by this epidemic, has been steadily increasing. Now, the most important thing to try to understand, in trying to understand this epidemic, is to step back from the specific details of one place or one time and get a sense of the whole. And the most important feature of this epidemic is that it's a new phenomenon. The virus is probably old, but the epidemic is new. The worldwide spread started in the mid to late 1970s, and that's a new phenomenon in historical terms in biology. And so there are several consequences of this newness of the epidemic. The first consequence is that the epidemic is still quite dynamic and unstable. It's not yet a stable, fully predictable phenomenon. And secondly, its major impact is yet to come. And I'd like to briefly illustrate these two major key points very briefly. First, in terms of its continued spread, it's dynamic. It's spreading still in every community and every country that's already affected. There is no community, there is no country in the world that can say that HIV infection has stopped being transmitted once it has appeared, once it exists in that community or country. To give a couple of examples of that, in the United States, it's estimated there may be between 120,000 to 250,000 new HIV infections during the next 3 years. So the continued spread in already affected countries is one element of the dynamism of the epidemic. The second element is the spread to new areas. This spread sometimes occurs quite rapidly. Let me give some examples. In Abidjan, which is the capital of the West African country of Côte d'Ivoire, in 1987, about 1% of the adult population of that city was infected. By last year, over 7% of the adult population of the city of Abidjan is HIV infected. Nigeria is a country that sits sort of between the large Western African epidemic and the large Central African epidemic, and by many people, particularly some Nigerians, was thought to be perhaps permanently immune to this. Now there are 500,000, estimated 500,000 infected Nigerians. But it's in Southeast Asia that the volatility of this epidemic has been most dramatically displayed. In Thailand, a few years ago, HIV infection was quite uncommon, even rare. Today, there are an estimated 400,000 HIV-infected Thais, which on a population basis means that the epidemic in Thailand is now 10 times greater or more than the epidemic in the United Kingdom. In India, where there may be already at least 1 million, there may be as many as 1 million HIV-infected people. In Burma, in all this area of Southeast Asia, we've seen a real explosion of HIV infection in a very short period of time. And these were areas that just a few years ago could have been considered legitimately at the edge or perhaps even not at all a part of the epidemic. The point here that's clear is that geography may delay, but geography will not protect against the arrival and the spread of this virus. So that there are countries in the world today, like Bangladesh, highly vulnerable to an epidemic of HIV infection, and yet thus far, by geography, has essentially been protected. And when its time comes, the key issue, of course, will be whether steps will have been taken to reduce their vulnerability. Thus far, nothing's been done because there's a sense of complacency that it won't happen to them. The third dimension of the dynamism of the epidemic is that everywhere the epidemic exists, it becomes more complex over time. And it changes, it evolves. For example, in the Caribbean in the early 1980s, most of the infections and cases of AIDS were associated with homosexual transmission. By the late 80s and early 90s, at least as much transmission is occurring heterosexually. So this has been a major change and shift in the groups affected in that part of the world. Similar changes have been documented and shown in the United States in terms of the evolving epidemic. And just to illustrate the complexity, in a single county, Dade County, Florida, where Miami is located, there are 5 separate sub-epidemics underway at one time. So the global epidemic is composed of thousands of individual epidemics with their own course, their own rise, their own special features. Now, the dynamism of the epidemic is the first key consequence of the newness of the epidemic. The second key consequence is that the major impact is yet to come. It's estimated that thus far there have been over 1.5 million adults and over 500,000 children who have developed AIDS around the world since the beginning of this epidemic. It's estimated by the World Health Organization that there may be 30 to 40 million people infected with the virus that causes AIDS by the year 2000. If that's true, then we'll see during the 1990s about 10 times more cases of AIDS in both adults and children than we saw during the 1980s. If there were 1 million adults developing AIDS in the 80s, there will be at least 10 million adults developing AIDS in the 90s. If there were 500,000 children developing AIDS in the 80s, there will be at least 5 million children developing AIDS in the 90s. Now, the WHO estimates, in my opinion, are too conservative for a variety of reasons. And I think that a more appropriate estimate for the year 2000 would be some multiple of the WHO estimate, which just increases all of the numbers and figures that I've mentioned. Therefore, by whatever measure you choose, whether it's the number of infected people, the number of people with AIDS, the number of children orphaned by AIDS, the impact on our health and social systems, the decade of the 90s will be much more difficult than the decade of the 1980s has been. So how are we doing globally in responding to this epidemic? I think we can distinguish 3 phases in time. During the first period, from 1980, roughly, 1981 to 1985, the epidemic was proceeding and we were doing very little about it. Certainly very little at the national level or at the international level. And then in the period from 85 to 89, we mounted a global mobilization that for the first time began to close the gap between the pace of the epidemic, which was continuing, and the pace of the work against it. Unfortunately, since 1990, we've seen a plateauing of efforts, a loss of social and political commitment. We've seen a decline in the increase of resources that are needed. We've seen the public attitudes about AIDS harden around the world. And as a result today, the gap is growing between the pace of the epidemic worldwide and the pace of the efforts against it. In summary, I would say that today the HIV/AIDS epidemic is an epidemic out of control. And by out of control, I mean specifically that it's an epidemic that has not been substantially influenced by the national and international measures we have undertaken thus far. That we are losing ground in our ability to control this epidemic. I would distinguish in that regard between 2 levels. There are examples, wonderful examples, of individual and community success in preventing the spread of HIV infection. And there is, unfortunately, on the other hand, a massive collective global failure to deal adequately with the scope of this problem, what it represents, and what will be needed to bring this epidemic under control. And therefore, to set the stage for this particular discussion, we find ourselves in front of the first real epidemic of modern times. And we find ourselves without a vaccine, without a cure, face to face with the fundamental social, political, and economic problems that fuel our vulnerability to this epidemic. It is an epidemic out of control, it is a global epidemic, and it would be folly to believe that this epidemic can be controlled within the borders of any single country. It's a global problem, and it's going to need an unprecedented and an unprecedentedly creative global effort to bring it eventually under control. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Deborah Work-Zowdy, who is an immunologist who is spending this year at the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. Most importantly, for our purposes, she was the program manager for the Ethiopian AIDS control program between 1989 and 1991. This portion of the program is intended to be our equivalent of up close and personal. How does AIDS look from the front lines of Ethiopia? Deborah Work.
Thank you. I have been given a few minutes to show you what the situation of AIDS looks like, as was put by Dr. Mann from the ground level. 10 minutes is not enough to show you what's happening. As a result, I have chosen a single topic, the funding problem, and 2 AIDS control programs in Africa. One, the Ethiopian program, because I was running it. And the second one, the Tanzanian AIDS control program. Not only because my Tanzanian friends are here in the audience, but because these two countries represent AIDS control programs which have been started at the beginning of the epidemic and somewhere in the middle. In doing that, I'll give you some demographic data. Ethiopia is a country of 52 million people. The first AIDS case was diagnosed in 1985. Until August 1991, 1,375 cases have been reported. If we look into the Tanzanian case, this is a country of 22.5 million people. The first AIDS case reported in 1983, and until June 1991, over 27,000 cases have been reported. If we look into the seroprevalence data of 1990-1991, the prevalence in blood donors in Ethiopia is 3.8%, and the prevalence in pregnant women is 3.6%, while in Tanzania, the prevalence in blood donors is 6.2%, and the prevalence in pregnant women is 14.5%. What I want you to remember when you listen to these figures is, one, the efficiency of reporting in sub-Saharan Africa by and large is very low. Be it reported cases, blood donors, or pregnant women, more than 90% of them are in the age group of 15 to 49 years. And if you take Ethiopia and Tanzania alone, this age group makes up about 40% of the adult population. As I said, I'll be focusing only on the response concerning funding, because earlier on when I was discussing this problem, again with my friends from that part of the region, we said, let's at least look at this, which would be a reflection of most of the problems that we are facing today. During the beginning of the AIDS control programs, the usual thing was the World Health Organization had a special program on AIDS, then went out and mobilized the international response. As a result, funding was coming from most sectors, and this funding was going into what's known as the WHO Trust Fund. And then WHO will help countries to design AIDS control programs, some of which were short-term and some long-term. And the money required for these programs, which have been spelled out according to the priorities of the country, would be funded from this trust fund. And that's how the program used to go on. The trend has been changing since the 1990s. As an example, I will tell you what is happening for funding in the Ethiopian program for 1992, for example. In the first place, Ethiopia is one of the countries which never had enough funding or enough donors because of the political situation in the country. In fact, we were one of the countries which suffered from what is known as the Brooks Amendment. So when I talk about the Ethiopian program, there is no US involvement whatsoever. In any case, for those donors who didn't mind their money being used for the Ethiopian program, the money used to come from the Global Program on AIDS, from the Trust Fund, and the program used to run that way. But invariably, halfway through the year, we would run out of money, and then the Global Program would supply us with bridging funds. As the political situation is changing, more and more donors are coming, but they are coming bilaterally. And not only are they coming bilaterally, they are coming with their own agenda. So if one looks into the 1992 pledged fund, for example, only $800,000 is going to the Global Fund. The rest of the $3 million is coming bilaterally. UNDP is giving about $600,000 for health education purposes. UNFPA is giving 50,000 for condoms, and Swedish SIDA is giving about 200,000 for home care activities. If we take the same scenario to the case of Tanzania, when they had the first year of their medium-term plan, which was 1988, they had $4 million, all coming through the trust fund. What has happened in 1990, and I have the 1991 budget in front of me, is, again, only $800,000 is going to the trust fund. They have more funders than the Ethiopians. USAID is giving $500,000 for condoms. Danida, this is a Danish organization, is giving about $700,000 for health education. EEC is giving some amount for STD control. And not only that, there are donors who prefer their money to be spent in certain regions in Tanzania. For example, Canadian SIDA is giving $2 million Canadian dollars through UNICEF, a third agency, to be used in a certain part of the country. Swedish SIDA is giving about $2 million to be used in the Lake region only. What this is showing, in fact, the question that would come to your mind would be, as long as you've got the money, what are you complaining about? But the issue here is, if money is coming to the trust fund, then programs would be run according to their priorities and to their needs. What is happening to most programs in Africa today is some sectors of the program, in some cases, some sectors of the region will be overfunded, while other programs and other regions suffer. And if you come from that part of the country, you can imagine how difficult it is to run a program. Having said this, although choice and poverty have never gone together, one can imagine the dilemma that a program manager has when the control activities are not run according to the priorities and needs of countries, but according to the preference of donors. 10 years into the epidemic, not many countries in sub-Saharan Africa could be proud of providing screened blood for transfusion and have an adequate supply of condoms, to just cite a few examples. This change in trend in the management and the coordination of funding has resulted in duplication of efforts, wastage of resources, and lack of coordination among donors and total confusion among programs. It's very common to find at least 10 different representatives in a very small country in Africa that are AIDS coordinators or donor agency representatives, but the money is not reaching the programs. Another problem connected with funding is the coming up of small non-governmental agencies. They are doing good work by and large. I will not be criticizing them at all, but what is happening is they are coming up in large numbers with no collaboration or coordination. This has again resulted in the duplication of efforts in this region, which needs the resources very badly. There is another problem related to this. More and more donor agencies are opting to give their money to non-governmental small agencies than to give their money to programs run by governments. When these programs were conceived, nobody planned for the replacement of the large number of experts that were coming into different countries, or for nationals who have been recruited from other programs to help in AIDS control programs. If we are thinking about self-sufficiency and eventual sustainability of these programs by these countries, then technical support, development of manpower is one thing we have to think about. Having said all this about donor agencies, what about governments in East Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa? We have seen different types of responses from different countries in this region. In general, most countries went through the stages of denial and towards opening up more and more as the disease progressed. The Nigerian example is a typical one. Precious time was lost when these governments took their time to make up their minds to disclose the situation of that epidemic in their countries. Once they have done this, the recent political upheavals and the civil wars in some of these areas and the rapid turnover in governments, which we take pains to educate, and then 6 months later or a year later, the government has changed, have resulted in a regression in the AIDS control movement, at least in Ethiopia, Zaire, and probably Somalia. This might lead to a Ugandan type of situation in these countries. It's well understood that governments in these regions are poor and have other equally devastating problems to deal with, and their action in most cases arises from fear of losing the little that they have. Besides, there are social and economic issues that are not under their control at all. Despite this, however, an effort to address the common problems such as giving AIDS the emphasis it deserves, at least in public medias, the institution of policies on AIDS, the inclusion of sex education in school curriculums, the difficulties created by customs officers in various countries to clear supplies for control programs, including expensive and perishable laboratory reagents that sit on the docks in the sun waiting to be cleared, while in the same country unscreened blood is being transfused for lack of reagents. Finding solutions for this is the least that's expected of them. In summary, the problems I mentioned above are problems limited only to the day-to-day activities of running an AIDS control program in most of sub-Saharan Africa, as portrayed by these two countries. I have not mentioned the impact of the AIDS epidemic on the existing poor health infrastructure. I have not mentioned the increasing problem of orphans, of which there are more than 100,000 in Tanzania alone. I have not mentioned issues related to condoms and other preventive methods, home-based care, and many more, as time will not allow me to do so. What I want to point out, however, is that these are issues that could not be dealt with adequately because of the problems mentioned above. Funding for AIDS control programs have never been adequate, with the epidemic spreading to other parts of the world at an alarming rate, and more countries requiring support, countries of Eastern Europe, for example. There is tremendous fear that the support for sub-Saharan Africa is going to get even less. Finally, what would we like to see? At least myself and my Tanzanian colleagues. We want to see more funding, more consolidation of efforts among donors, emphasis on long-term solutions such as sexually transmitted disease control and condom promotion, and a very important issue, which I didn't have time to go into, the emphasis on female-controlled preventive methods. If we could find solutions to these problems and manage to initiate the same governments of both rich and poor countries that could mobilize their entire population for war to do the same for the fight against AIDS, then we can fight this epidemic as one. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah Work. Maybe we can return to some of those issues you skipped over in the question period. Our next speaker will be Richard Bissell. I'm pleased to welcome him back to Boston. He received a master's and a doctorate degree from the Fletcher School. He's been an assistant administrator of the Agency for International Development since 1986, first for policy and program coordination, and since 1990 as the Assistant Administrator for Science and Technology, where he oversees programs in health, agriculture, rural development, child survival, among other things. In this job, he is really the point person of the executive branch for U.S. government programs directed at international aids. Richard, look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that introduction. I particularly appreciate the scene setting that Jonathan and Deborah work did, because there's a lot of reality in this issue which I think we need to face up to. Even as we in AID and all of you as concerned think about solutions, the reality is that it is getting worse every day with every passing month. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, both to urge us on to do more and to put in perspective those small successes that we can claim along the way. I'd like to break my introductory comments here into two parts, if I could. One, I want to talk a little bit about the lessons learned. Joe urged us to do that in terms of what's happened since 1986. And then I also want to talk a bit about the plans for the future. I might say in terms of the future that my focus will be on the prevention and education side of the AIDS issue, because issues of vaccine and cures are actually handled by HHS and through the NIH research effort, which is very large and is obviously investing a tremendous amount of money. I might express one concern about that, which relates to my focus upon developing countries, is that I fear we may come up with a cure or a vaccine which is essentially not affordable in developing countries. It's important to keep a context in mind that in many countries in Africa, the annual per capita health care expenditure available is $3.50. If you think we're going to come up with a vaccine that costs less than that, I'll hug you. But I'm a little worried about that. Let me start, as I said, with a few of the lessons learned we've gotten out of the last 6 years of experience on our part. With regard to programs, since 1986, AID has been the largest financial supporter of the global program at WHO, $91 million in commitments. We have also, through various AID bilateral programs, supported some 650 AIDS activities in 74 different countries. What we've gotten from that is that at a sort of demonstration pilot project level, that it is possible to show some success. There's been innovative programs to reach out to high-risk populations, to truck drivers, to prostitutes, to try to change behavior. We've seen, for instance, in Africa, a 5-fold increase in condom distribution. I think that proportion is going to keep going up very rapidly in terms of condom use. The second lesson that we've learned from our programs is that condom access is essential. There's knowledge, but they have to have access to the condoms at a supply and a price that works within their own economies. The third lesson is that community bases, building that community base is terribly important in helping to educate people. In that context, we have relied a good deal on NGOs because many of them are very grassroots focused. And so we have deliberately tried to support the evolution and the strengthening of NGOs at the community level. The last lesson I would just mention is that it's terribly important in education prevention to have multiple reinforcing communications. One can have a mass media campaign, but you also have to have one-on-one peer group pressure for people to begin to change their behavior. One can have targeted marketing campaigns, and they will play their part in this kind of effort, but it has to be sustained, it needs to be constant, it needs to reinforce that kind of message. I suppose in an American audience one doesn't have to say that. You know how Coca-Cola works, but the fact is that when you go out and educate to change behavior, it's terribly important to sustain that message. In terms of lessons learned on the epidemiological side, I'd just cite a few. One is that the predominant issue is sexual transmission. We have worked a good deal on blood supply issues, and I think most countries, in fact, have in place mechanisms. Deborah mentioned issues of supply, and those need to be worked on, continue to work on. But sexual transmission is the issue. And we've also learned that a way of getting at the prevention of HIV is to focus on sexually transmitted diseases. STDs are so prevalent and they are so coincident with the issue and a factor in the spread of AIDS that the linkage between STDs generally and HIV is crucial. And the last, in terms of epidemiology, as Jonathan pointed out, is that the epidemic is spreading out there way ahead of us at a rate, particularly in Asia, that we know still to be accelerating. It's also accelerating within geographic areas, within different countries. The one that alarms me the most, frankly, is the changing male-female ratio. In Africa, most estimates by WHO show an even balance between men and women having AIDS. Latin America, there's still a differential. Their latest estimate showed about a 3-to-1 ratio there, but it's closing fast. The surveys in Sao Paulo showed that within a matter of a few years, we'll probably have equal number of men and women infected, which is a terrible symptom with regard to women's health and the future of the world. It's, of course, something that's been dramatically portrayed as rising as well in the United States as heterosexual transmission of AIDS becomes much more prevalent. The third area of lessons learned I want to mention has to do with leadership. In the public sector, Deborah mentioned this, we do need more leadership. It's encouraging that, in fact, the leaders of the Organization of African Unity will be meeting in May. There has been put in place by some very courageous ministers of health in most of those governments to have them pass what I think will be a very strong resolution with regard to AIDS. Not a subject that, frankly, most leaders want to take up in public. But I'm hopeful, and all signs are that they, in fact, will take a strong stand on AIDS that they can take back to their own countries. In the private sector, we need more leadership. People have to speak out. Let me move to our plans for the future. We have just completed in the 86 to 90 period what's in effect the first 5-year segment of our program for combating AIDS. There was a total of $161 million spent by AID on the international campaign against AIDS. Almost half of that went to WHO, global program, the other half went into bilateral programs. We have planned for the 91 to 95 period $385 million, which is almost 2.5 times as much. And in fact, we're ahead of schedule on that. My sense is that we're in fact going to end up closer to $450 or $500 million for the 5-year period through 95. Somewhere around 35% of that will go to the global program of AIDS at WHO. In terms of strategies, let me outline just 3. One is the focus on prevention, as I said. That is AID's policy. And we will focus in on the HIV-STD linkage for controlling. The second strategy has to do with the focus on sexual transmission. Reduction of partners, where there's a major behavior change required. Increased condom use, particularly that access to condoms. And lastly, diagnosis and treatment of STDs, which thereby reduces associated AIDS. And last as a strategy is increasing support to NGOs in order to build that community base. And a number of different agencies are working together in terms of making sure that this does not end up in a highly uncollaborative approach. Deborah Work's absolutely right that NGOs can go off in their own direction, but they need to be associated with overall strategies for managing AIDS issues within individual countries. To put this 5-year strategy in place for the 91-95 period, we recently negotiated a large cooperative agreement which will take this tack, and I just want to lay out a few of the elements. It's important to me that we begin to show that we can make a difference with our international effort. Having an epidemic which is rapidly accelerating, as Jonathan said, and for those who are trying to work in it seem to be spitting in the wind, really doesn't carry a lot of weight in the long run. So the new project that AID is supporting, in fact, will take 15 countries that are being selected through various consultations to develop fully comprehensive programs with those governments, which will cover everything from applied research, policy dialogue with those governments, support of NGOs, program interventions, where we think we really can make a difference. The countries that we're thinking of in terms of first-year priorities, I might just mention so you understand the kinds of examples we're thinking of. In Africa, we're talking about Ethiopia, Malawi, Senegal, Tanzania, and Zambia. In Asia, we're talking about Thailand. In Latin America, we're talking about Brazil and Jamaica, where there's political leadership as well as private sector leadership willing to move on this issue, and where the kind of support we can provide will hopefully be able to show that we can make a difference for all of those who want to, in fact, muster greater enthusiasm for this. In other countries where AID has worked, we will continue providing some limited technical assistance, but they will not have the kinds of comprehensive support we want to provide to those 15 emphasis countries. We will continue applying integrated behavioral research out of lessons we've learned in the last 5 years. And lastly, there will be a focus on policy, because it is important that there be that kind of policy leadership. Let me just summarize. I think we have learned something from the experience the last 6 years. Not that we can break the back of it, but that we have enough individual experiences that we can magnify those and replicate them elsewhere. Second is that it will take a comprehensive plan in terms of addressing this. Thirdly, we need to take a long-term approach. No Band-Aids here. Education, behavior change really does take time. And lastly, we really need to make a visible difference. Thank you.
I'm pleased also to welcome June Osborne back to Boston, where she did her residency training in pediatrics. She's currently Dean of the School of Public Health at Michigan. More importantly, for tonight's purposes, she chairs the National Commission on AIDS and is also a member of the Global Commission on AIDS of the World Health Organization. She's been involved on both the research front and the policy front of this issue since the outbreak of the epidemic, and she told me she would be willing to entertain a question on how she directs Magic Johnson, the newest member of her commission, after he spent a career directing everybody else on the basketball court.
Well, I'm going to have to be a little rude about the United States leadership role, because we haven't really taken one. This is one of the more dramatic examples of do as I say, not as I do. And as such, I'm really quite uncomfortable in my present situation. And the reason I'm uncomfortable is that I know most of what I know about this by having had the privilege of working with Jonathan Mann since we got to know each other in 1986. So it's worse than carrying coals to Newcastle to have me standing up here and commenting about international issues. And I'm going to take a little bit of a liberty to comment from my vantage point as chair of the U.S. National Commission on AIDS, because the questions asked about what has happened, how we contributed to it, and what efforts have fallen short, I would much prefer to talk about in the context of the United States. And I am going to say why. First of all, we're part of the globe. And in this epidemic, we were its epicenter. We were in a position, for once in human history, the trouble hit where the resources were, and we were in a position to lead the way, and we haven't done it. In fact, it is sometimes embarrassing to me to sit with a wonderful colleague like Deborah Work and listen to the things that have been done without resources, but with commitment, with a sense of understanding of the common humanity that is involved in this. We really are now a global village. This epidemic is the lesson that says so. We did, in fact, mobilize some of our resources, particularly in the biomedical research arena, to the point where, and within that arena, I include epidemiology, although biomedical researchers sometimes forget to, that in that context, we learned with extraordinary rapidity what we needed to know to curtail the rapid spread of this virus. And it worked. And we had the resources to study that and show it. And we showed it. And then we haven't used what we learned. We haven't as was suggested here, followed our very own precept. If you have a preventive message, you must give it clearly and repeatedly in the language of your intended listener and by various media. That's well known. We haven't done it in the United States. And countries around the world look to us for leadership and are puzzled. We have learned a good deal about the kinds of ways you can intervene. And it's very clear that one intervenes with sensitivity and caring and great attention to the dignity of people with whom you want to intervene, or you don't, it doesn't work at all. And when I used to go to the actually before the Global Commission on AIDS, when I used to go to WHO for consultations that John had about various specific issues, looking at them from a global point of view, used to think that the first couple of times, boy, this is going to be complicated. We're going to have to talk about this with, people from 25, 30 countries and all the different really distinctive cultures and so forth. And even the first time when I came back, I thought to myself, wow, no, that was simple. This country's complicated because we're trying to get those cultures to work together in a very intimate way. And then as I thought more about it, I thought, well, we're partway along a very difficult road. And if we can learn something about that, then again, we can be helpful to others. But right now, we're still being exclusionary. We talk about them versus us. We talk about caring more about people who get infected one way than another way. I lost it yesterday with a high administrator in my university because he came into my office to talk to me about something else. Saw a picture that was in the Boston Globe that I liked of Magic Johnson when we were here in March that I liked so well. I paid the Globe their usurious fee for a copy, and it moved President Bush's picture back and put Magic's right there. And the administrator made a terrible mistake. He said to me, he said, Magic Johnson seems to be a wonderful man. I said, yes, he is. And he said, that's really sad. He said, and I was really sad about Arthur Ashe the other day. I said, yes, it was. And he said, I feel even sadder about that because after all, the way he got it. And I said, I don't. I have never been able to find one case of HIV infection sadder than the next, and I hope someday we will all learn about that. You should have heard this poor guy trying to get out of it. It just got it got so bad. He left in 7 minutes, and it was a half-hour appointment. I think I'm in trouble with my university again, but anyway. Let me say some of the things that we've learned in the United States that we should be helping others with. First of all, in the biomedical arena, I strongly second Dr. Bissell's comment. We must be looking all the time and in anticipation for ways to take whatever we learn in terms of blood testing, in terms of ways of delivering care, home care, as Deborah Work has mentioned, and lots of other things like that. Certainly vaccine when it comes, and treatments as they come to extend the quality of life of people with HIV. As any one of those even comes up on the horizon, we have to be struggling to look for ways to make it accessible to all of our people around this global village. That's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of work that isn't biomedical. It's going to take a lot of the work of the expertise that's, I presume, is represented here. But it should be up front, it should be early, and it should be urgent. And along with that should be behavioral research. Social sciences should be right up there and very strongly supported, because we already know that it's only going to be if we do that work too that any of this will matter to more than a very favored few in this global village. So we've really got to do some hard work to reorder our priorities. The last time I looked, for instance, the NIH budget was $850 or so million for AIDS research, of which I think it had been $5 million was for behavioral and social sciences, but it was going down to 2.5, if I recall, and that was a year or so ago. People looked very surprised at me when I spoke up in the research review meeting. I was there ex officio for the commission, and said that I didn't think that was enough. They looked very surprised at me. So we've got a lot that we need to do to learn. What work we have done in that area has actually proved fruitful. And if we didn't think that we could help in those arenas because we're not so good ourselves at some of it, I want to point out that some of the Western European countries have been paying very good attention to us since the beginning. They noticed, if we didn't, that heterosexual spread was starting right up. They noticed, if we didn't, that the condom usage message was a universal message that should be given out. I like to point out that you can't get very far off your plane at Heathrow without going past a sign that says life insurance 15 pence with a picture of a condom, and that's been true for some time now. So we aren't learning our own messages, and we are sending false messages. We, as the advanced edge of the epidemic, have seen the spread from urban to rural, and the fastest growing growth in our epidemic is in smaller communities in rural areas of the United States now. Nobody believes that, but it is true, has been for some time. In fact, when people ask me about the international epidemic, when I'm talking around the United States, I always start by saying, okay, I'll try and tell you whatever I know about what you want to hear, but let me tell you first that there's an example of it that I can match in the United States for any statistic you want or any kind of detail you'd like to go into. So we're just not doing it right now. We're not leading, and worst of all, the leadership at the center is absolutely dead silent, and other countries have taught us about that too. One thing, and I think I'm going to make this my summary comment, that troubles me really a lot now, even though we haven't done it well, at first we did it vigorously in parts, at least, the biomedical science and so forth. And now there is a tendency to say that the epidemic is going to have peaked in the developed world by the mid-1990s. Now, I don't know what the word peaked means, or at least what I know of what it means is horrendous. But that tends to get said in roughly the same tone of voice and often by the same people in same context as the comment that we've done enough about AIDS now, that it's time to turn our attention somewhere else because, after all, more people in the United States die of heart disease and cancer and so forth. That's what I think of as the snapshot approach to this epidemic, and I was particularly glad when Deborah Work said she was going to be presenting Ethiopian and Tanzanian data next to each other as the epidemic moving 5 years forward. We need to do that about ourselves, about the world. We have to recognize that we have been, even in our own context, exceptionally short-sighted, and in the context of our membership or our citizenship in a global village, horrifyingly so. I think the Thai experience that Jonathan referred to is something to make that point finally, in that we gave the first clue along the east coast of the United States that if you didn't control injecting drug use in this epidemic, you didn't have this epidemic under control no matter what else you did. And we saw it very quickly consume more than 50% of injecting drug users up and down I-95. You can draw a map of I-95 by plotting the cases of AIDS now appearing in injecting populations along the East Coast. Now, that experience alerted people. I think it had something to do with Edinburgh's becoming aware of what was happening to it fairly quickly. Certainly cities in Italy and Spain and other places had similar experiences. And then the Thais had that experience and went from almost no infection or very, very little infection in early 1988 to, as John said, 400,000 or more cases of HIV infection by now. And I bring it back up as the final point because we in the United States again failed to learn our own lesson. We have not done anything to stem the injecting drug use epidemic in this country. And except for the East Coast, it's sitting there like an accident waiting to happen. 6% injecting drug users infected in Los Angeles, 10% infected roughly in Detroit, 10 to 12% in Chicago. Anywhere you turn where you can do a little bit of a study of that sort, there are thousands of people ready to get infected through needle sharing, through lack of access to treatment, through being forced into slightly constrained circumstances compared to where they are now. And our whole approach to the injecting drug use epidemic, which the Commission has referred to as a twin epidemic to the HIV epidemic, has been to try and seal the borders and incarcerate everybody as a therapeutic measure. So as long as we do that sort of thing, we haven't learned our own message, and again, we're sending to the rest of the world the message that we have trouble caring about our own. We have trouble believing in what it is we're exporting in the way even of the newly gained information that we should have. So it's uncomfortable to stand up here and talk about international issues because we have so much to do in the United States.
There's no way to wrap up because we'll also be having there's a time for questions and discussion, but a couple of quick sort of reflections on what's been said and maybe a little bit of a context there. The word leadership's been used a lot. I'd like to suggest, based on some of the discussion here, at least 5 ways in which the United States can start showing some leadership in terms of international AIDS. First, in terms of policy. You know, we have a policy in this country that is seen as discriminatory towards people who are HIV infected from other countries. And that's why we have a meeting in Amsterdam this July instead of in Boston. That policy is embarrassing if you happen to be an American and you happen to be abroad. Because people will say, well, you know, I know there are other countries that have a policy like that. Saudi Arabia, Cuba, China, India. It's just terrific. It's terrific to be, so to speak, in bed on human rights issues with countries like that. So we can change our policy and start showing some policy leadership. Secondly, our support or lack of same for the United Nations system. The United States has a very ambivalent attitude towards the UN, as you probably know. It goes back and forth and still doesn't pay its bills. When you don't pay your bills, you don't really have a right to complain as much as we do, and you don't, unfortunately, have a right to participate as much as we should. So we can start by paying our bills to the United Nations. That, after all, we're legally obligated to pay those bills. Pay them and give the support to the United Nations system, which means to the community of nations, to do the work that needs to be done. Third, in terms of programs, and June alluded to a number of these, leadership in programs, leadership on sex education, as June points out, first for our own people, our own children. Leadership in terms of condoms, leadership in terms of needle exchange, leadership at a programmatic level. A fourth kind of leadership, which was alluded to by Mr. Bissell, and that is the leadership on vaccines and drugs. June mentioned this as well. Why should we just accept the fact that the AIDS vaccine, when it's available, is only going to be available to the rich? Because that's what's going to happen. Unless there is leadership. And leadership means, in this context, not stopping until we find an acceptable solution. Surely we must have the political, economic, social creativity to figure out a way to make an AIDS vaccine available to all those in the world who would need it when it becomes available. You know, when the first polio vaccine came out, the Salk vaccine, it wasn't available in enough quantity to give to everybody. So it was given to the children in this country who needed it the most because they were at the highest risk. When AIDS vaccine comes out, it should be used with the globe as our unit of analysis, and we should use it first for those people who are at the highest risk, pure and simple. That's the way to bring a global epidemic under control. But of course, that would contain the rather revolutionary idea that a life in Tanzania, a life in Ethiopia, and a life in the United States are of equal value. And then a fifth area of leadership. A fifth area of leadership has to do with our relationship to developing countries. We have a very strange relationship in general, as expressed through our various policies and institutions, to the rest of the world. We think we know, we think we have to teach and they have to learn. We confuse the fact that we have resources, financial resources, with the fact that with the idea that we have more wisdom than others. And therefore our overall relationships with other countries are constantly shackled and handicapped by this idea that we know what to do if they would only listen. So what all this boils down to, in a sense, is actually a broader issue. I'd like to close with this. The broader issue is the question of the role of health in defining our priorities at the national and international level. I must say it's pretty amazing to realize that governments tremble, and I mean literally tremble, when the inflation rate goes up a little or the price of gasoline goes up a little. But there's never been a government that's fallen because of a doubling of the rate of homelessness or because of unacceptable differences between the infant and child mortality rates of people of color and white people. These are reasons which ought to be important, because when you ask people what's important to them, people say that health is a central concern in their lives. And therefore, for some reason, we are failing, not only in the United States, but more broadly, to translate the fact that health is a central issue for people around the world into policy that reflects the use of resources and the energies that would reflect that concern for health. So I think we have a larger question, and it does go under the name of leadership, but I think there's a way forward. And it comes actually from a proverb. It's a proverb from the Old Testament that goes like this. It says, when the leaders lack vision, the people suffer. That's the first half of the proverb. And we know that that half is true. The second half of the proverb goes, essentially, but there is hope and strength in the counsels of the people, and we are the people.
Okay, the floor is open for questions. There are microphones on both sides of this floor. Please, a question, not a statement, and state your affiliation or identity and, if possible, person you're addressing your question to, if there is one.
My name is Patrick Myers. I'm an undergraduate at Harvard. Let me see. Do you know what the implications of the recent reorganization of the UN will be for the global program on AIDS and other relevant UN programs? And if this reorganization is viewed as an opportunity, what new priorities should emerge from the UN?
Okay. I guess you'd call it the effort to revitalize the United Nations broadly, which is now underway under the leadership of the new Secretary General. And from what I understand, he's focusing first on the UN, the core UN. Then he wants to turn to the specialized agencies, of which the World Health Organization is one. And I think WHO and UNICEF, in a sense, are typical in the sense that they've done a lot of good things, they're very strong, they have a lot of potential, but they're not realizing their potential. They're not actually looking towards the modern world, this world without frontiers, the global village, a world in which a worldwide epidemic can appear the way AIDS appeared. They also have too narrow a vision, in my view, of health. They are still thinking actually just in old terms, old-style terms. So I think that the UN has a tremendous potential. It's not being realized. There are many that we could speak obviously a long time about what's not right with the UN, but there's a lot of things that are right about the UN. And one of the things that's right is that it still represents our best hope to get countries of the world together and work together on a common problem. In 1987, for the first time in its history, the UN General Assembly had a debate about AIDS. That was the first time it's ever talked about a disease in its history. The resolution that came out of that was as beautiful a resolution as you could like. What we have to learn how to do better on is following through. And I think the UN system, what I hope will happen is that the UN system as a whole will be revitalized somewhat under the new leadership, and then we'll see the wave of innovation and creativity creep into the other agencies as well.
Hello, my name is Richard Farraker. Ms. Osborne, you mentioned that the United States leadership at the center is dead silent. Would you care to speculate, or would any of you care to speculate as to why that is?
It would be speculation, and as such, I don't know as I have anything very useful to say. I think we are trying very hard, continue to try very hard to change that. I should comment that people in the government have been working, many people in the government have been working very hard to overcome the effects of that silence, but there is no question that we have crippled ourselves by the lack of that central voice of leadership. You and I could speculate, perhaps come up with some of the same reasons as to why that is, but I think we are paying a tremendous price, among other things, for a level of homophobia in this country that's intolerable.
My name is Jack Needleman. I'm a doctoral student at the Kennedy School. Question to Ms. Zudi and Mr. Bissell, perhaps some comment on the domestic scene by Ms. Osborne. The message I got from your presentations is we may not know how to cure AIDS, but we know an awful lot about how to prevent it. And I was wondering if you could describe what would be a core, a basic prevention program for a developing country, the key program components, and then give some estimate of what it would cost per capita to implement that program. And then I say, Ms. Osborne, if you could comment on the same thing for the U.S.
I'm going to ask everybody to call me Dr. Osborne. I'm a physician. It makes a difference when I answer those kinds of questions, because I think if people assume I'm not a physician, perhaps I don't sound as authoritative or something. Insofar as what we know to do, we know a great deal about, or at least I think we are learning a great deal about the importance of teaching kids about sexuality at a very early stage so that they can later learn the lessons that are necessary to avoid the virus of AIDS, and that needs to be done in a very thoughtful way that meshes with other health education so that they are able to see themselves as healthy, growing people, growing into adulthood in a way that allows them to care for themselves. Condom usage is second best for very young people, obviously, to abstinence, and yet at least in this country and in many parts of the world, sexual intercourse begins at a very early age, and it is not wise to pretend or to dislike that fact so much that we don't do what's appropriate in the face of the facts. The answers I have to give you of this sort are very simple. They don't sound very sophisticated. They are sophisticated when you get to the actual doing of them, which is why I stressed behavioral and social science research as much as I did, because we need to learn a lot more, as you can intuit if you think about other health problems, about how to change behavior and so that people can in fact invest more in their own health. Actually, one of the things that's been happening in this epidemic is that we've been learning enormously useful lessons through AIDS about how to impact health behavior in other arenas. And so there's lots, as in many other contexts, there's a lot of spin-off going to come from what's being done there. But in terms of the practicalities of prevention, it's one of the reasons that I and the National Commission have bemoaned the fact that all of the research thrust, or a very large fraction of it, is focused on biomedical interventions as opposed to some of the behavioral research very necessary to become more effective in prevention. Deborah Work, I don't know if that differs greatly from what you'd say, but I shouldn't dominate.
Thank you, John. With permission, allow me to answer your question indirectly. I would definitely not be able to go into the costing with an immunology background and program manager. That's out of my limit. But I will take three of the points that have been discussed as preventive methods, especially by Mr. Bissell, and reflect on that. Sexually transmitted disease control, for example. In sub-Saharan Africa today, we do not have simple diagnostic methods or treatment which is affordable for things like syphilis, gonorrhea. Okay? Not only that, because of the very poor health infrastructure, there is a tremendous amount of resistance to the existing cures, to the existing treatments. I'll mention a very small study to you. We studied about 200 sex workers for HIV, and then for other sexually transmitted diseases. The prevalence was in the 60s and 70s. That, if you thought that was shocking, what was most shocking was 90% of them were resistant for penicillin, 86% for ampicillin, and 80% for Bactrim. Now that's a new antibiotic. Okay? So these are the facts that we have to look into when we talk about, yes, if we control STDs, we can control HIV. Condom promotion. There was a point in my program where we would go out and teach people, especially the youth, we'll say to them, the way to go is to have protected sex. The next question would be, where are the condoms? And sure enough, we didn't have a single condom when I joined the program in 1989. Okay? These are issues that we have to look into. Behavioral change, fantastic. That would be the way to go. But when we talk about behavioral change, I don't want you to forget the sex workers in sub-Saharan Africa who have been implicated with 1,001 names. None of them qualify truly to them. It is a way of life. It is a question of survival. We have been working with prostitutes very closely. I haven't come across a single one who says to me, I like this profession. All of them say, I have a child to feed, I have a grandmother to take care of, so on and so forth. So these are issues which we have to take into consideration when we say, do you have 4 solutions for solving the AIDS problem in Africa? Thanks.
Dr. Bissell, you want to comment?
I would just add 2 thoughts. And I agree that we can't cost out what it would take, because we're not talking about a commodity here, in 2 ways. One is that only with some more experience in terms of really comprehensive programs will we begin to get a sense as to what it might cost over a long period of time. And it's probably going to vary a good deal from one country to another. The other is, and this goes back to the broader health issues that have been raised, is that in many ways we're talking about institution building. And institution building doesn't really have an exact price tag on it. That is, to sustain the broader health interventions, the broader kind of feedback analysis for behavioral research and behavioral change is something that will require the building of capacities. And so we don't know what that will cost, but it does mean that we have to have, if we care about it, we have to have faith to go ahead and do it without an exact price tag on it. And that's where I think there's a leadership issue, both here as well as in developing countries, just to say it matters that much, even though we don't know what the exact price tag will be.
Joe, can I make one?
Oh, yes, please.
Just one comment that's too timely to miss. For those of you who haven't been watching, go and watch before they stop running the clip of the Chicago infrastructure that was photographed a week before it gave and would have cost $10,000 to fix. And then listen as they talk about what's happening now as they try and pump 40 feet of water out of the sub-basements of many of the buildings in the loop, and how many billions of dollars that will take to fix. We're talking the same stuff here.
Hi, I'm a first-year MPA student here. I have 3 questions. First, Dr. Osborne, I was interested in hearing more specifically about the priorities and activities of the National Commission. Second, Dr. Bissell, I was interested to hear about the correlation or connection between sexually transmitted diseases and AIDS, and I wondered if you could explain a little bit more specifically what that relationship is. And third, I was interested in what the hoped-for outcomes are of the global conference that's coming up in Amsterdam.
So far as the National Commission on AIDS is concerned, I'd be delighted to give, well, I'll say it out loud, and those of you who don't write fast, the National Commission on AIDS, I'll say it out loud twice. The National Commission on AIDS would be happy to respond to your interest. That we issued a comprehensive 2-year report in late September, which is available either in executive summary form as a fairly small, I think I got that one here, or a much thicker but still quite readable form with 30 recommendations, which we tried to be chary about the numbers so that it was a manageable set. That can be obtained by simply contacting, for single copies, the National Commission on AIDS at 1730 K Street Northwest in Washington, 20006. And we'd be very pleased to have your interest. Other reports will be forthcoming. We've been giving them seriatim as well, but that one in particular will, it's got the list in the back of that as to what other reports we've done before, and the others will be, I hope you will hear about as they come out.
We were just discussing on the STD, first of all, on the sexually transmitted disease issue. The basic point here is that if a person has another sexually transmitted disease, and it probably includes most of the other sexually transmitted diseases they might have, and they are also infected with HIV, then they are probably more infectious through sexual intercourse than if they did not also have that other STD. Similarly, if you have a sexually transmitted disease and you have sexual intercourse with someone who is infected with HIV, your risk of becoming infected is increased. So there's a kind of as you can see here, a very close relationship and a kind of mutually reinforcing relationship in that sense between the risk of HIV transmission and the presence of other sexually transmitted diseases. Through that reasoning, you can see that if you were able to diagnose, treat, and hopefully prevent other sexually transmitted diseases, this would have a dampening effect on the transmission of HIV through sexual intercourse. But even more importantly, if you're actually dealing effectively with other sexually transmitted diseases, which includes primary prevention, you're also helping to prevent another sexually transmitted disease called HIV infection and AIDS. So that's why the linkage is so important, as was mentioned by Dr. Bissell and also by Dr. Zowdy. In terms of the Amsterdam conference, it's a meeting that is expected to bring about 10,000 people from literally all over the world and from many different disciplines to Amsterdam. The International AIDS Conference is a unique event. There's nothing like it in health. There's no other situation in which you have the geographical diversity, the disciplinary diversity, and the active presence of people who are affected by the issue, by the health problem itself. And in that sense, there's something quite special about these conferences, both in terms of the capacity to exchange information, learn from each other, develop the concept of global learning, which is critical because we have a lot to learn and we have a lot to teach, and also the concept of global solidarity. And there's something actually quite important about what happens when people go to this conference in terms of how their own commitment, their own strength, their own belief in the importance of what they're doing and the fact that it is possible to be successful in this fight. Some of that strength that comes from seeing others from different places, talking with them, listening to their successes, their failures, and knowing that you're not alone. So for me, and just speaking as one person, what it gives me when I walk into a room and there are 10,000 other people and they're all working together, although we have many of our differences among us, is something that by itself makes it worth the trip, makes it worth the expense, because it gives you the strength and courage in many respects for another year. Now, there are a lot of details, and we'll be happy to make copies of the program available. It's a program that gives equal weight to the science of AIDS and to the social aspects of AIDS. It's a conference that has involved for the first time the genuine involvement in the preparation of the conference of people from non-governmental organizations, people who themselves are infected, and people from the developing world. It is truly an international conference. It's also an international experience. It's the kind of experience on which solidarity is based, not just the idea, but the practice of solidarity.
Hi, my name is Ruth Lawson-Stopps. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. My question is directed to Dr. Zowdy. I was very interested in a number of the issues you brought up at the end of your talk, and in particular I wonder if you would elaborate on women's control programs that you mentioned.
I was hoping that somebody will ask that question. In all the efforts that we have seen so far, the problem has been the lack of this control method, which is not in the hands of women. Take condoms, for example. At least what we see in our part of the region is sex workers would use it with their clients, but not with their regular partner. Men would use it with sex workers, but not with their wives. Most of the AIDS control programs have focused on female sex workers in Africa. It's only later on that when data was coming from antenatal clinics with the pregnant women that people realized women who have not left their village were becoming infected. This is because women that are monogamous are involved in a sexual relationship with their husbands who are not necessarily monogamous. So if you see the sex workers, the housewives, the women at large, it is because this method is not under their control that they're running into all these problems. I don't know how many of you know about the female condom, which has taken quite a few years to be developed. And when it has been developed, some tests have been done in different countries. there are a couple of problems with it. It is an advance on its own, so I'm not saying that it shouldn't have been done. But the problems are such that women still need to have the cooperation of men to use it, beside the cost, which is about $3. Women in sub-Saharan Africa will not even see this thing. The way to go, hopefully, will be something which will kill the bacteria, which will kill the virus, but which will not kill the sperm. Because women need to reproduce for a number of reasons, some of which are well taken and some of which are negative. So if we could come up with a microbicide which could do this, women don't need the cooperation of men. They will get pregnant if they want to. And by doing this, we are not only protecting women, we are protecting society. It's not the concern for women per se, which they deserve. But by doing that, we are protecting the next generation, the society.
Thank you.
I'm Betsy Greer, a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. Dr. Bissell, you mentioned in your comments a passing comment that private enterprise should be more involved in this epidemic. Do you have some specific ideas of how private enterprise can be involved?
Actually, the term I deliberately used was the private sector because I wanted to be sure that I included both the nonprofit as well as the for-profit private sector in terms of taking a leadership role. In the nonprofit sector, quite clearly, NGOs need to play a much greater role. And for many of the issues which are simply not, which have to be community-based, first of all, and secondly, are not going to be, I know won't be well funded, such as care issues for people already infected. The establishment and the strengthening of NGOs is very important to make that happen. In the for-profit sector, once we get into issues of broad-based sustainable distribution of, for instance, condoms or other kinds of whether they're female condoms or other advances that may come down the road, for that to truly be sustainable, they will need to be distributed. And over the long haul, that means having adequate private sector distribution mechanisms. So, for instance, it's been very helpful in terms of moving into, to take one high-risk group, truck stops, that in fact those condoms are sold through truck stops throughout much of Africa at a generally, initially at a very subsidized rate, but eventually over time, hopefully to reach a market rate where people will want to buy them and therefore will access them. And there you have to have a willingness of the private sector to become involved and see this as something as important as Deborah Work said, of people in Heathrow Airport selling condoms. But that is something that needs to build over time. We can't expect it to deliver right away. But as I said at the end, this being a long-term effort, it's got to be something that in fact the private sector does become involved in.
Okay. Is there another question? We have time for one more. Yes?
One question. My name is Martha Trudeau. I'm a mid-career MPA student here at the Kennedy School and a registered nurse. I have a question on testing, and I'll let the panel members decide who will be appropriate to answer. I'm wondering if there have been any recent improvements in the antigen testing, and will improvements in testing help in the long run in prevention?
The antigen testing, as opposed to the antibody testing, which others may not realize is what is usually done for the blood supply and diagnostically. Antigen testing is not, probably never will be, at the same level of usefulness. That's for biological reasons, in that the antigen is intermittently and unreliably present at various stages of infection, and it varies from one person to another as well. It's a very helpful test in certain specific individual care circumstances, but as a screening test I don't anticipate that technologic change will change the usefulness of that. Do you agree, John? And so I think that aspect. What was the second part of your question?
Just if improved testing will help in prevention, because there are such gaps at this time.
Actually, I think if we didn't have the test, we'd be better off. We have misused the test so badly and substituted it for counseling that I recently wrote a speech about if we didn't have it, wouldn't we be better off? And I convinced myself, for at least the purposes of that speech, that it was at least a draw. But the tendency to rely on it, to turn to it, to try and do things with it, and is invariably coupled with a wish not to do any of this difficult stuff. And it's true with the vaccine, too. When we get a vaccine, it will be an add-on to what we already have to do, not a replacement. So there's a tremendous urge to turn to technology to excuse ourselves from dealing with the human parts of this epidemic. And in that sense, I would say an improvement in testing would be a disaster.
Well, I'd like you to join me in thanking not only the panel for a most informative discussion, but also David Shackman, a student here at the Kennedy School, who was instrumental in helping bring this forum about.